We live in a pretty negative world. I don't think that's an aha moment for any of us. We understand it, we get it. The world around us is, for the most part, negative. It surrounds us. It's in everything that we do. In fact, back in 2020, Pew Research did a study, and they found that 65% of adults who interact with social media feel more negative about themselves, about others, and about their future. And it makes sense because not too much that we see in social media or that we interact with in social media is really positive. Think about this. When was the last time somebody posted something that you didn't like or that offended you and that just stirred in your brain over and over and over and over, and you had to figure out how you're going to respond? It's one of those moments, right? It's all around us, and that negativity just stirs and stirs. Think back on your week. How much of what you heard or what you saw or what you interacted with was negative or made you feel negative or feel bad or question you or what you're feeling and what you're thinking? We do this with our kids. We tell our kids, don't be so negative, don't be so negative. But then the next minute, we are telling them what's wrong with them, that they need to change. And we need to do that because that's part of discipline, right? If they do something wrong, we need them to know it. It's terrible parenting if we don't tell our kids what they're doing wrong. That's like, okay, go play in the street, it's fine. I'm not going to say anything because I don't want to hurt your feelings. No, we got to tell them that, right? But at the same time, we say, don't be negative, and then we become negative. Or we start talking about somebody in our lives and our kids are around, or something in our lives, something that happens or something that we don't like, and all of a sudden it just jumps to negative. And here's the thing. It's so pervasive all around us that it feels like we can't escape it, that we feel like we can't even get around it. If you've ever been around somebody who never seems to say anything positive, you know how draining that can be. And so all around us is all this negativity. And if negativity is all around us, then how do we escape it? And really what we need to think about is, well, what's the heart of the negativity? Where does that come from? How does that begin? Where does that start? Because if we want to overcome the negativity, we need to know where it started. And the reality is, negativity is a fruit of sin. Think about this. When Adam and Eve were in the garden, before they sinned, do you think there was ever a moment when they walked up to God and they said, I don't really think these bananas are very ripe, God? They didn't have anything negative. But as soon as they made the decision to sin, negativity entered into their world. God, these clothes you made us are a little itchy. We need to improve them, And so that's just the nature of sin. It starts inside and it turns the good into ugly and sin. And so how do we get away from it? How do we change it? If negativity is all around us, then how do we get past it? And we have to understand that ultimately the negativity that is happening around us, we would like to think that it's not us, but ultimately, negativity comes from our own hearts. Let me kind of explain it this way. If you've ever been disappointed, what is the heart of that disappointment? The heart of the disappointment is something didn't work out the way that I had planned. Something happened that I am disappointed in. You behaved in a certain way, you did this, or this situation happened, or I had all these hopes and dreams and now it's this. Disappointment comes from that part of, well, I didn't plan this. Think about the idea of discouragement. Well, life just never works out for me. Every time I turn around, it's something bad that happens. Discouragement starts with, I didn't plan for this. It didn't work out for me. If you've ever experienced hurt, if you've ever experienced somebody doing something that hurts you or something that happened, you feel like whatever you're going through you don't deserve or you've been mistreated in some way. I've been mistreated. I don't deserve this. Another thing that stirs negativity is stress and anxiety. And if you think about it, the whole idea of stress and anxiety, the reason why we're stressed and anxious is because we're out of control. We're overwhelmed with feeling out of control. I'm not in control of the situation, and so I'm stressed out and I don't know what to do and I got to fix it. If you've ever felt guilty, I messed up. I made a mistake. And those thoughts just keep going through your mind, and it's hard to escape them. If you've ever felt angry, you know where it comes from. I'm not getting what I want, and so I'm going to lash out. And I can't control it. It's just, you're making me angry. This situation's making me angry, and it just stirs into this negativity. If you've ever been offended, you feel like whatever was done directly to you, and it's offensive to you. And this person that said this or did this, I feel offended. And so I know all of that feels negative, right? But what's the common denominator in every single one of those situations? Me. I feel this. I experienced this. I went through this. I'm dealing with this. It quickly turns us into one of the highest marks, one of the biggest things of our culture, one of the best markers, one of the things in our culture that everyone wants. I become a bigger victim than you are. I become a bigger victim. See, negativity turns me into the center of my universe. And so when we think about it, it's really coming from inside. The common denominator of negativity is me, but also the way to overcome it is also within me. But it feels impossible. And this is the beauty of Psalm 96. Because in Psalm 96, the writer gives us the secret to overcoming the negativity all around us. Because it's not just being positive, it's so much more simple than that. And you're going to be surprised that you have already, and you are constantly already participating in this. Turn to Psalm chapter 96. We're going to take a look at what the psalmist tells us about overcoming negativity. Psalm 96, it's a very simple psalm. It's about 13 verses. And really the whole purpose of this psalm is to take the center of attention away from me or whatever I'm going through and put it into a different place where I'm created to be, where God wants me to be. Psalm 96. Follow with me. We're going to go through these verses together. He begins and he says this: sing a new song to the Lord. Let the whole earth sing to the Lord. Now, it just starts off really simple. He says, sing a new song. Let me help us understand this. What he's going to share with us cannot be minimized, cannot be reduced. What he's going to do is he's going to try to stir wonder and amazement into our minds, into our hearts, and draw us into this understanding of what we're called to be and do. And so the focus is going to be on the glory and splendor and majesty, strength, salvation of God. But to do that, he begins with a very simple action call to sing a new song. The words sing or bless, declare, proclaim, these are all calls that begin in this awe and wonder in your heart, and it becomes a vocalization through your mouth in response. It's not just singing some lyrics that are up on a screen. There's something that stirs deep within you and it draws you to sing. And in fact, he says, sing a new song. It should be new. It should be fresh. It could be an old song, but there should be something new and fresh that continues to stir in it. And he's beginning by calling the whole earth to join in. Everything, every single thing. And so really, what's amazing about this and where he's trying to get us to catch is that you and I get to join in the earth with worship. It's new, it's fresh. Listen to what he says in the next verse. Sing to the Lord, bless his name, proclaim his salvation from day to day. You see, this aspect that he's drawing us to is not just to sing songs, But there's a blessing of God that happens when we do what we're called to do and created to do. And he says, proclaim his salvation from day to day. If you are a follower of Christ, you know about salvation. If you call yourself a Christian, you know about salvation. The salvation that he actually saved you. And for that to stir in your heart and to make that and to make that grow and feel that should stir something inside. He goes on and he says this in verse 3. As he gets into the character about who God is, he says this, declare his glory among the nations, his wondrous works among all peoples. For the Lord is great and highly praised. He is feared above all gods. For all gods of all the peoples are idols, but the Lord made the heavens. Splendor and majesty are before him. Strength and beauty are in his sanctuary. You can just feel this buildup as the psalmist writes. He starts recognizing the majesty, the splendor, the strength of God. And he calls all nations, and he says all these gods that they worship, all these idols, all these things that they've elevated to be more important or the center of their attention is nothing in comparison to God. In fact, if we were to kind of modernize the way it was written in Hebrew, the whole idea is that all the gods of all the peoples are nothing. In fact, the way that we could even think of it is this way, is that these mighty things are mighty worthless compared to God. And the earth is called to recognize that. Everyone is called to recognize that. He says, talks about his splendor and his majesty and his strength and his beauty are in this sanctuary. Imagine for a moment that you're walking into this throne room, into this court, and you're going to go see the one who holds your very breath in his hands, the one who, when soldiers surrounded him, said, I am he, and they fell to the ground backwards just at his voice. And you and I are welcomed into this court. And as we walk into this court, we know that he holds our very breath in his hand. He could decide that we should not exist anymore, and yet he calls us into there. And as we enter in, it's as if the robe of his glory and majesty and splendor are surrounding us in his mercy and grace, and we are covered in it, and we are thrown to our knees in this worship and this focus of who God is, that we get to worship him. It's not a little moment. It's not a simple, hey, let's just go do this real quick. It's a call for something deeper. He goes on in verse 7. He says, ascribe to the Lord, you families of the peoples. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory of his name. Bring an offering and enter his courts. Worship the Lord in splendor of his holiness. Let the whole earth tremble before him. He uses this phrasing, ascribe, worship. It's a repeat from Psalm 29. Psalm 29 is calling, it's using the same kind of rhythm, the ascribe, worship. As what the angels are doing, and now he's saying you and I get to do the same thing as the angels do. Ascribe to the Lord, all of you families of all of you peoples. This escapes us a little bit. Remember, this is written to Hebrew people, but there's a group of people who are not allowed to step into the presence or into the sanctuary of God, and it's the Gentiles, and yet the psalmist is saying all peoples. In fact, he says, all families of all peoples. He emphasizes the importance of the family worshiping together and stepping into this moment where they weren't allowed to be. The Gentiles had to stay on the outside, and they weren't allowed to be into the court, and yet they can come in and be, and they're welcomed, and they join in as a part of. He says in verse 8, ascribe to the Lord the glory of his name. Remember Deuteronomy. Remember Exodus, where God is explaining the things that the people of Israel are supposed to do to honor him. And he says, don't take the Lord's name in vain. And oftentimes what we do is we kind of ascribe that to, well, just don't use God's name the wrong way. But it's so much deeper than that. When we call ourselves a Christian, we are taking on the very name of God, and that name is holy and amazing and splendorous and wonderful and overwhelming. And for us to take on the name of God and to minimize it to just a simple flippant word that we would use. Or to use it in a way, or to abuse it in a way that we have put on Christ, and yet our actions are not very Christ-like. It is to take the very name of God. It is sin, it is evil, and God is not honored at all. And he says, ascribe to the Lord the glory of his name. Bring an offering and enter his courts. You see, the Gentiles, they weren't allowed to do this. But here the psalmist says, because you're welcomed in, because you're part of the earth, because you're part of creation, because you've been created in the image of God, because he loves you, he is welcoming you in to even bring an offering. And it's just a small thing of what God has done for you, and it's just a small little bit, but for you, it's such a big deal, and you need to recognize that even just giving a little bit is a big thing. Giving what you can is a big thing. And God welcomes it. And he goes on. And he says, worship the Lord in the splendor of his holiness. Let the whole earth tremble before him. This is not something that's small. This concept, there's no other proper response before God than to tremble, because his name is holy, and we are called to honor that and to glorify him and to bless him and to sing to him and do all this. But remember James, the half-brother of Jesus, who didn't believe his brother was the Son of God until he watched him die on the cross, raised from the dead, and he went, oh man, I've been living with the Son of God. And he says, you believe? Good. The demons believe and they shudder. Do we tremble when we think of the opportunity we have to worship God? And the psalmist says that as we enter his courts, we are called to realize what a serious moment this is, and we get to participate in it. You are called personally to ascribe, and worship. And then he says this in verse 10. Say among the nations, the Lord reigns. The world is firmly established. It cannot be shaken. He judges the peoples fairly. Let the heavens be glad, let the earth rejoice, let the sea and all that fills it resound, let the fields and everything in them celebrate. Then all the trees of the forest will shout for joy before the Lord, for he is coming. For he is coming to judge the earth. He will judge the world with righteousness and the peoples with his faithfulness. He brings us back to reality and imagining as we get to stand before God, reminding us that God is going to judge us, and there's going to be a point when every person will bow their knee before God and recognize who he is. And the choice that you and I get now is to decide to worship him the correct way or to wait till that day when he judges us. And he says the earth is already worshiping him. The heavens are glad, the earth rejoices, the sea and all that fills resound, the fields and everything in them celebrate. All of these things, the trees are filled with joy, and we get to join in worship. On the surface, it feels like this is disconnected from the New Testament. But what the psalmist is doing before he even knows that there's going to be a man by the name of Jesus who steps on earth, who is the Son of God, before he knows that the Messiah is going to come, he is saying that God is going to send his Messiah. This is a manifestation of Jesus. This is the gospel. This is what the gospel brings. Because of what Jesus did, we actually can worship God the way we've been created. And if this passage is the reality for all of us as Christians, then what gets in the way of us worshiping God that way? Negativity. Us. Seeing things the way that we want to see them instead of seeing things the way God sees them. Focusing on how our lives are a wreck instead of how amazing God is that he's given us the trees and the joy that comes from being in worship with the earth. This past week, as I was working through the message, I got this article from John Acuff about positivity versus negativity, which was kind of, and I was like, oh, that's ironic. And so I kind of read through it, and I was inspired by a lot of it because there's some things that I realized I can do better, and there's some very simple things in it that kind of helps me kind of think about being positive instead of focusing on the negative, because it's so easy for us to do that, right? And in it, he talks about how positivity increases creativity. Because, see, what negativity does is it minimizes hope. And if you lose hope, you don't want to be creative, because what's the point? Positivity deepens friendships, where negativity just makes you more miserable. And misery doesn't love company, it avoids company. If you've ever felt miserable, you don't want to be around anybody. You don't want anyone around you. You feel gross, and everybody's terrible, and you don't want to do anything, and you just want to be alone. But positivity deepens friendships. Positivity opens up opportunities, where negativity just makes me more cynical about every situation that I'm encountered. Oh, I can't do that. Oh, that's not going to work out. Oh, it's never going to be good enough. All of a sudden, negativity stirs and changes the opportunity into a missed opportunity. He kind of got to this point where he said, basically, are you the type of person who sees a glass half full or a glass half empty, or do you see it completely full with scorpions and spiders and darkness and depression and everything's full of that? What kind of person are we? And he talked about positivity, and it was good, and there's a good part, but as I kind of started thinking about it and wrestling with it, I was like, why is positivity so hard? Because I've forgotten what I'm called to be. I'm called to worship God. I'm created to worship him, and my sin gets in the way of that. The reality is we're made to worship God. We're made to worship God together. We're made to worship God with each other, like we have been doing this morning, but it's so much more than what we do at church. Sometimes my mind and my heart, I just cringe when we minimize the idea of worship to just singing. When we say, let's worship, and we are really saying, let's just sing. Because we are minimizing what worship is, and we're reducing it to something that it's not. It's not just singing, but it's blessing, and it's glorifying, and it's honoring, and it's trusting, and it's thinking about, it's giving attention to. And what the psalmist is trying to get us to do is understand this, that the greatness of God overpowers the greatest negativity. There is no match for the greatness of God, and we are called to focus on that. You see, worship is not a church service. It's not limited to what we do on a Sunday morning. In fact, the psalmist would tell us that it's the secret to overcoming the negativity that happens all around us. Worship is just a fancy church word that basically means to give intentional attention or to make much of something. So when we make much of our past, we are worshiping our past rather than worshiping God. When we make much of our circumstances, we're worshiping our circumstances, not God who has been through all of it with us and helped us bring us to this point. Oftentimes we worship other people's treatment of us or what they think about us, and we worry about it, and we focus on that, and we worship their treatment of us instead of worshiping the way God thinks about us, that we are a son, we are a daughter, we are his chosen, we are his prince, we are his princess, we are part of his family, we are the one that he loves. You see, what the psalmist is trying to tell us is the negativity around us is not worth our attention. God is. And God deserves our attention. You and I are made to worship a holy, magnificent, all-powerful God who has welcomed us into his presence, wrapped us in his mercy and grace and love and hope and peace, and he's just surrounding us with that, and yet all we can do is go, yeah, thanks, God. Sunday morning's good. Okay. Oh, life is tough. What would it look like if a group of people decided that worshiping God was more important than everything else around them? How attractive would a church family be? Not because we're always happy and honky-dory and everything's perfect. That's not real. That's not realistic. But that in the middle of our chaos and our difficulty, we know the value of coming together to worship God does something inside of us. It's not just singing together, but there's something about singing together that deepens in our soul of understanding what a holy and awesome God we get to worship. And we join in with creation in worshiping him. You see, being a Christian is not making much about you. It's not making much about whatever your circumstances are. It's not about making much of your failures. It's not making much of what people think about you. Being a Christian is making much of Jesus. And so whatever gets your attention, gets your worship. Whatever takes our attention and whatever we focus on in those moments, when those negative thoughts, when everything around us seems to be negative, where do your thoughts go? Do you give your attention to those thoughts or do you give your attention to God? It's simple. It's just really hard. And it is incredibly difficult to do it on your own, which is why we come together on a Sunday morning to remind us, not just through communion, not just through singing the songs, not just through reading the word, but what it means to come together and worship God and put our attention on him and how it changes us from the inside out. So this week, what are you making much of? On a daily basis, what do you make much of? What gains your attention? What do you focus on? Maybe the reason why we struggle with negativity is because we have forgotten what a privilege it is to join in with all of the earth and worship God. That we get to step into his presence on a Monday morning, Tuesday afternoon at work, Tuesday night as we're shooting off fireworks. We get to worship God. We get to celebrate who he is. The freedom that Christ has given us from the sin that overwhelms us, the negativity that stirs inside of us and that forces us to forget how amazing God is.